Welcome to our multi-session forest invasive species webinar. To start out, I just wanted to let you know a little bit about Zoom. Some of you might not be familiar with the Zoom platform, but if you look at the bottom of your screen, sometimes you have to take your cursor down there to make the bottom toolbar pop up. But you should be able down there to have a couple buttons for different functions. And if you click the chat function, you can send any technology questions or technology issues there, and we can help you out with that. Josh Benish is helping facilitate the webinar today, so he might be the person responding to your questions there. And if you have any questions during the presentations for the presenters, please send those using the Q&A function, and then we can answer those during presentations. So this webinar is hosted by the Central Wisconsin Invasives Partnership, or CWIP for short. We're a cooperative invasive species management group, and we focus on terrestrial invasive species issues. We focus on education, mapping, control projects, but we're not the only cooperative invasive species group around. There are a bunch of different groups across Wisconsin, and you can see that on the map there. The different cooperative invasive species groups in Wisconsin. We recommend reaching out to these groups in your area. They focus on a pretty wide variety of different projects, but they are always available as a resource for landowners and for interested individuals. So for more information, please visit the IPAW website. That's on the slide. We can also probably post that in the chat to click that link. And then just another heads up, we have another educational opportunity coming up. CWIP isn't directly planning this or holding this, but we are encourage you to check it out. It's the Upper Midwest Invasive Species Conference, or UMISC. The conference will be held from November 2nd to the 6th. So that's going to be an entire week of presentations on all kinds of different invasive species topics, from aquatic invasives to forests to prairies, focusing on prevention and mapping and control, all kinds of information. So it's going to be a really good opportunity to learn more about invasive species. And since it's online this year, the registration cost is going to be less expensive than an in-person conference. Yeah, so more information, you can go to umisc.net. And also, if you're just interested in woody invasive species, as part of UMISC, there will be a Woody Invasives of the Great Lakes Summit Thursday and Friday, and you can sign up for that for free to just go to that and not get the rest of the presentations from UMISC. For more information on just the Woody Invasive Summit, you can go to woodyinvasives.org. So we recommend you checking out UMISC. And now we're going to get right into our first presentation. I'm going to give this little intro thing during every presentation just in case people are ducking in and out for different sessions that interest them. So our first presentation I'm going to present, my name is Asa Plonsky. I work for Golden Sands, RC&D in Central Wisconsin, and I coordinate the Central Wisconsin Invasives Partnership. I'm going to talk about common forest invasive plants, and I'm going to talk about how to identify them so you can know what you're dealing with on your property or if you're volunteering on the property where you're volunteering. So I'm going to get this new slide up. Okay, can people see my slides? I'm going to assume yes. Okay, sounds good. So, common forest invasive plants. Before we start, please, if you have any questions, send them via the Q&A, and I can answer them as we go, or I can answer them all at the end. But highly encourage questions. I want to be able to talk to you guys and answer any questions that you might have. So I'm going to talk about 6 different common forest invasive plants. You probably know some of these, you might not know all of them. So we're going to get into it right away. Our first plant is garlic mustard. Garlic mustard is one of the more well-known species. Garlic mustard is a biennial plant. Biennial means that it grows usually for 2 years, flowers during the 2nd year, and then once it's done flowering, it dies. Like the name suggests, the plant smells like garlic, especially if you crush it. The smell is pretty pungent. For identification of the leaves, the first year plants have leaves that come right out of the ground, and the leaves are like kidney shaped with scalloped edges. Second year plants have a stem, and they can get kind of tall. Usually I see them less than 3 feet tall, and they can even flower just a few inches tall. Sometimes I see just real small plants flowering. But they have a stem, and the leaves at the bottom of the stem are similar to the first year plants. As you get higher up on the stem, the leaves take on a more triangular shape. Garlic mustard flowers are white, and they have 4 petals. They flower in May to June, so pretty early on in the season, and the flowers are clustered on the tips of the stems. Garlic mustard fruit is a pod, but it's thin and green pod. In the lower right-hand picture, you can see the pods just starting to form on that plant. Later on in the season, the seed pods dry out and they turn brown color, and you can see that in the photo in the lower left. Those are the dried out seed pods of garlic mustard, and if you look closely, you can see the dark seeds still kind of embedded in those pods. So that's what garlic mustard looks like for much of the year, especially towards the end of the year. Garlic mustard is a pretty big problem because it invades forest edges, and roadsides, and garlic mustard outcompetes native plants. It's particularly bad because the native plants that garlic mustard outcompetes tend to be native spring wildflowers, which people really like because they're the first flowers that you see in the spring. They're very pretty, and they're really important ecologically because spring wildflowers offer some of the first food sources for a lot of insects, including bees and other pollinators. So it's a really good idea to control garlic mustard on your property, to keep those native plants, give them a good habitat for native plants, which supports insects, pollinators, and all kinds of different wildlife. Garlic mustard is also an issue because it is potentially allelopathic. You're going to hear me say this word a couple times in the presentation. Allelopathy is when a plant releases substances that inhibit nearby plants. So they cause native plants that are nearby to not grow as well and not reproduce as well. So that's no good. So garlic mustard is a really good one to control. It looks like we have one question already, so I'm going to open that up. Diana Nichols asks, can you use garlic mustard for human consumption? Yes, you can. Garlic mustard is edible. I would say be careful to make sure that you're collecting from an area that you know is not being controlled through chemical means. So if it's on your property, that's good. And if you are going to eat it, pull all of it so it won't spread anymore. And it can be eaten raw in salads. People make pesto out of it. It does taste like garlic. So you can do that as part of your control plan, is eat it. So I'm going to get on to our next plant. Our next common forest invasive is black locust, or Robinia. And black locust is a tree. It grows into a very large tree, and it has alternate leaves with a bunch of leaflets. So those things that you see that look like leaves are leaflets, and they're oval shaped, and there's a bunch of them, and they have smooth edges. The twigs on black locust are green or brown, and a lot of times they have white spots called lenticels, and they have paired thorns or spines, and these spines occur at each bud or each node. The older bark on black locust is really deeply furrowed, so that's a little more obvious. You can see that in the lower left. Black locust flowers are white. They look like pea flowers if you're a gardener and you know what pea flowers look like, but they are in drooping clusters that are kind of underneath the leaves. Later on, black locust makes a seed pod that also looks like a pea pod. It's flat and it ends up turning brown, and it has these mottled blackish seeds that are inside the pod. These seed pods are not edible. They're poisonous, so don't eat them. So black locust is actually native to some areas of the US. It's native to the Appalachians, but it's not native to Wisconsin, and it is regulated by the state as an invasive plant. It can cause problems because it grows really fast, and it grows in these really big colonies where all the plants are connected via the roots. And once you start cutting black locust, the stress plant will send up more shoots, more little saplings because it's stressed out. So it can be kind of hard to control sometimes. And black locust invades forests and open areas, and it'll outcompete native species. Also, from the perspective of someone just trying to walk around on their land to hunt or to hike, black locust is not fun to walk through little plants because they're all thorny. So it kind of inhibits travel sometimes. All right, our next plant, bush honeysuckles. So there are a few different species of invasive bush honeysuckles, but they share a lot of similarities. They're woody shrubs, and they usually have multiple stems. They don't look like trees, they look like shrubs. They have opposite leaves, and the leaves can vary from oval to more football shaped. The twigs are hollow if you were to open a twig. You can see that in the lower left photo of the twig. This is kind of important because there are some native species of bush honeysuckle in Wisconsin. I usually see them more in the northern part of the state. But the native bush honeysuckles should have twigs that are solid throughout and not hollow. Otherwise, native bush honeysuckles aren't going to have the thick kind of stems that the invasive bush honeysuckles have, and they're also not going to be growing in such dense patches. But if you have any questions about if the honeysuckle you're looking at might be native, please reach out to your local cooperative invasive species group or reach out to Wisconsin Bush Protector Network or UW Extension. Just ask around because we are around to answer your questions and we want to make sure that you're controlling the right plants. We have some more Q&A questions. Kelly on Facebook Live asks, are white snakeroot and soapwort invasive species? Because they're really crazy around my place. White snakeroot is native, although it is a more aggressive native plant. And soapwort or bouncing bet is not native and in some cases can be invasive, so that might be a good one to control. Ann Jesperson asked, how does one get rid of black locust if they get more vigorous when they're cut? I recommend herbicide use, careful herbicide use. We are going to share in the outro some resources for control, so we'll have some links there. And then another question, Lizzie on Facebook Live asked how to control soapwort. I think that one can be hand pulled, but I don't know that one off the top of my head. If you are here for the outro slide, we'll have links to control resources from other agencies and you can check out there and they should have some more answers about control. Okay, back to bush honeysuckles. Another thing to point out these plants is that the older bark is brown or gray and it sometimes starts to peel off in strips, so it looks kind of shreddy. Bush honeysuckle flowers are pink, white, or yellowish on these invasive bush honeysuckles, and they flower in May to June. The flowers are kind of tubular and they have long petals. They're very showy, they're pretty, and they smell nice. That's why people planted them. And later on in the season, the flowers are replaced by red, shiny berries. Usually these berries are paired, but not always. Bush honeysuckle is a problem because it grows in dense patches that outcompetes native plants. And the leaves grow earlier in the spring and stay on later in the fall. This can change conditions on the forest floor. It changes how much light is reaching the forest floor, how much moisture reaches the soil and stays close to the soil, and it can change the nutrient conditions. So this can kind of have some interesting effects on the ecology that native plants wouldn't normally have. So it can kind of mess with the food chain when your leaves, leaf on and leaf off, are different than native plants. Bush honeysuckle is another one that might be allelopathic. I don't think there's solid research really confirming that, but it is something that scientists are looking into, that this plant might be releasing compounds that interfere with other native species around it. Our next plant is common buckthorn. This is probably the most well-known invasive plant in Wisconsin. I had a photo of this on our Facebook event and it got a lot of discussion and interested people. So common buckthorn is a shrub or small tree. It is often multi-stemmed. The eggs are usually like close to opposite, but they can be alternate. They're egg-shaped and they have pointed tips. The leaves have toothed edges, just slightly toothed, and they have 3 to 4 pairs of veins. The twigs often end in a short thorn. You can see that in the photo of the trunk there, that the twigs sticking off from the trunk have little stout thorns. And the bark is a grayish color with lighter lenticels. Lenticels are like spots or lines. And if you were to scratch off some of the bark, the inner bark on buckthorn is like a yellowish orange color. I'm going to pop into the Q&A again. We got some more questions. Neil DeMeyer asks, do native bush honeysuckles have solid twigs versus hollow? Yeah, native bush honeysuckles should have solid twigs, while the invasive bush honeysuckles have hollow twigs. Carrie Campbell asks, are the flowers or fruit edible? I'm guessing that is for honeysuckles. I'm not sure about the flowers. The fruits are not edible. Don't eat the fruits on bush honeysuckles. I don't think they'll kill you if you eat one of them, but they don't taste good. I can say that from experience. And Jason Callbaum asks, is the hollow solid comparison on honeysuckles the only way, or is there berry flower differences? I'm not totally sure about that one. Kelly might have more information if she thinks about that in her presentations. But the twig is a good way to tell. Also, the stems on the native bush honeysuckles are never going to be the thickness that invasive bush honeysuckle stems are. And the leaf shape is a little bit different. However, I think there's like 3 or 4 species of native bush honeysuckles. Not totally sure, but there's more than one. And the most common one is Lonicera canadensis. And that one has very thin stems. The leaf shape's a little bit different, should have solid twigs. The other species aren't very common at all, so you might not see them at all. Kelly on Facebook Live asked, do bush honeysuckles have the same color berries? Yeah, I think their berries should always be orangish or reddish colored. And Stacy Olson asks, can buckthorn grow out of other trees? I appear to have several trees in my yard line that have buckthorn growing out of it. It's probably just growing from like behind. So when I see buckthorn growing in a forest, I usually notice the leaves and the berries, but sometimes it takes a little more digging to find the stem that the plant is coming from. So it's coming out of the ground somewhere. It'll just take a little digging around to find it. And Rebecca on Facebook Live asks, is alder buckthorn also invasive? So sometimes alder buckthorn is used to say glossy buckthorn, which is Fringula ulnis, which we'll get to later, and that is invasive. There's also a native species called alder-leafed buckthorn, and that is native, not invasive. Okay, back on to the presentation. So common buckthorn, the leaves are egg-shaped, the twigs end in thorns, and the bark is grayish colored. The flowers are kind of greenish yellow. They're not very noticeable, and they flower from June to July. Common buckthorn has separate male and female plants, which is actually kind of nice because if you're starting to control common buckthorn on your property, you can target just the female plants first to stop seed production right away, which will help in the long run, and then get to the male plants later. And female plants produce berries later on in the season. The berries start out green and they turn a shiny black color. You can see that in the photo on the slide. Common buckthorn the berries are not edible, don't eat them. When birds eat them, it makes them defecate, which is why the seeds spread so well, and it will probably do the same thing to you, so don't eat them. Buckthorn grows in dense patches that outcompetes native plants, so it's really good to control to keep your native plants healthy and reproducing. And just like bush honeysuckles, the leaves grow earlier in the spring and stay on later in the fall, which messes with the light, nutrient, and moisture conditions in the forest, which can mess with other plants and wildlife, insects. It really just throws a wrench in the whole ecology. So that's common buckthorn. Next, we're going to talk about glossy buckthorn, which in some cases is called alder buckthorn, but it is Latin name Fringula ulnis. So this plant is, again, very similar to common buckthorn, but there are some slight differences. You manage them the same ways. The same management they use on common buckthorn will work on glossy buckthorn. They're closely related. Glossy buckthorn, like common, is a shrub or small tree, often multi-stemmed. The leaves are a very similar shape, except that they have smooth edges instead of toothed edges. And the leaves have a lot more veins, which is a little more obvious in this photo. The twigs are kind of a reddish color, and the twigs have white lenticels. You can see that in the middle photo. And glossy buckthorn shouldn't have any thorns, so that's another way to tell the difference. And the older bark on glossy buckthorn is kind of a grayish color, kind of splotchy, but you can still see some lenticels on there. Glossy buckthorn flowers are similar to common buckthorn, greenish, not very obvious, and berries are similar. They turn from green to red to black. Glossy buckthorn does not have separate male and female plants, and in many people's experience, it will make berries on younger plants than common buckthorn. So in some ways, harder to control potentially. Glossy buckthorn also has reddish colored roots. You can see that a little bit in the lower photo. If the roots are wet, it's a little more easy to see the reddish tint. Glossy buckthorn, just like common buckthorn, is a problem because it grows in dense patches and outcompetes native plants. And the early leaf on and late leaf off of glossy buckthorn also interferes with the ecology of a site. And then our final plant in the common forest invasives category is Japanese barberry. This is a multi-stem shrub and has arching branches. With Japanese barberry, I never notice the trunks getting very thick. I always see pretty thin stems on this plant. Not saying that it couldn't happen, especially if they're on a site for a long time, but I usually tend to see smaller stems on these plants. And they usually aren't super tall. I've never seen a barberry taller than me, and I'm pretty short. I'm just a little over 5 feet. The leaves are arranged in clusters along the stem, and they're kind of oval to spoon-shaped and have smooth edges. The stems are brown, they're slightly grooved, and they have single spines at each node or leaf cluster. This is another very pokey plant. Japanese barberry flowers are a yellowish color. I think they're kind of like umbrella looking, and they hang below the stems, and they flower in April to May. The fruit is a bright red oval-shaped berry, and you can usually see it in the winter. It stands out pretty strongly against the snow. Japanese barberry is another just growing in dense patches, outcompeting native plants, so that's an issue. The upper right-hand photo I took last week, that has Japanese barberry growing up next to maidenhair fern, and I can see that the maidenhair fern, which is a really lovely native plant, is really starting to get choked out by that barberry. And within a few years, I don't expect the maidenhair fern to still be surviving in that spot, just because the barberry is taking it over and making the conditions not good for the maidenhair fern. Another important thing about barberry, and a really good reason to control it, is that a lot of research is showing that areas that are infested with barberry have higher populations of ticks and higher populations of ticks specifically that carry Lyme disease. So this, from a public health concern on your property or parks or wherever you might be working, it's really a good idea to control Japanese barberry to reduce the tick populations. All right, so those are all of my plants. I believe we have one more Q&A question that I can answer. Diana Nichols says, my property is extremely invaded with common buckthorn. How do I get rid of it and control it? I know to get rid of the females first, but there's so much of it. We are going to have an outro slide with some resources for you to look at for specific control guidance, but I would just recommend that it's a long haul and do what you can and work from the outer edges of the infestation in, and that it's not going to all happen in 1 year, and that even if you're only able to do a little bit at a time, it's still really going to help your wildlife and the property to be better for native species and native plants and animals. Okay, so that's all the plants. I'm going to go to our outro slide that has some resources for control and other resources. So this is our little outro slide. This has a lot of resources for folks interested in learning more. I know a lot of you are really focused on controlling plants on your properties, and we aren't really covering that in these presentations. We're focusing more on identification. But for control, I especially recommend looking at the Midwest Invasive Plant Network's website and the Wisconsin First Detector Network fact sheets. These have species specific, so you can look at what species you have, type that in, or scroll down to where that species is and open up resources specific to that plant and what kind of tactics work best on it, what kind of herbicides work best on it, and kind of plan your control from there. I also wanted to say our CWIP website, the Central Wisconsin Invasives Partnership website, we have identification and management info under resources. We don't have species specific management info, but for identification, we are making fact sheets for all of the species that will be covered in all of the presentations today. And those fact sheets will be uploaded in the next couple of weeks in that identification section. So if you're interested in seeing those fact sheets, please check out our website in the coming weeks and we'll have more resources there. There's a couple more Q&A questions that I think we can get to before 10:30 when our next presentation starts. Barb asked, does buckthorn ever grow as a choking vine? Buckthorn does not grow as a vine. Later on, Oriental bittersweet is in one of these presentations. That might be something that you're looking at that might be an issue. It has leaves that can sometimes look like buckthorn, and it does choke off trees, and it's invasive. So that might be worth looking into. Carol Rick says, I've seen services that bring in plant-eating goats to strip out a property. Do you have an opinion on goats? Thanks for doing this program. It's very informative for the novice plant people. Goats can work, but it's not going to work in 1 year. It's going to need multiple years, and usually as part of a larger management plan, maybe with mowing, maybe with herbicide. If you don't like using herbicide, goats are a good option to kind of beat things back and a good place to start. And there are a lot of different companies that rent out their goats for you. So yeah, I think that's a good idea. And Wes Marcial says, can we get a copy of this presentation for the pictures? We are going to post a recorded version of this webinar onto the CWIP website. So I recommend checking out that. We'll have that posted in the next couple of weeks. And I'm sure we'll share that on our Facebook website when we have the recording posted. Do native species ever become invasive? It says that Anne wants to answer this, so I think.
Sorry, that was my mistake. I was going to type an answer, but I hit the wrong button. So you can answer if you want, Asa. Asa, can you hear me? Okay, I was going to type the answer, but I hit the wrong button. But anyways, I can answer it. So by definition, invasive species are non-native plants that show that they cause harm to the environment or economy or human health. So by definition, native species won't be invasive, but that doesn't mean that, you know, you can certainly have native species that grow aggressively and that you would choose to manage alongside managing invasive plants.
That's a great answer. And then Judy says, why are garden centers allowed to keep selling barberry? Some cultivars are still allowed to be sold. There's a lot of things going on with the regulations, but there are many cultivars of barberry that are no longer allowed to be sold. I'd recommend just reaching out to your neighbors and encouraging them to plant native plants instead, and telling them about the benefits that native plants can have for wildlife. And I think that will do a lot to help prevent these plants being planted. And then finally, Nancy asks, do these pertain to northern as well as central? I'm up in Vilas County. Yes, all these presentations are focused on Wisconsin as a whole. So these common plants are in many places across Wisconsin. You might not have all of them in your area, but they're definitely good to know and look out for. And yeah, this should all be pertinent to northern Wisconsin. Okay, so all of our Q&As are answered, and in a minute we'll get on to our next presentation. I'll have to redo the intro again, so I'll go to that slide. We had one more question shared for our first presentation in the chat section, so I don't think you guys will be able to see it. But Sam asks, or Diana asks, oh, no, I mixed this up. Debbie asks, when in doubt about native versus invasive plants, is it better to destroy them? I would say no. Native plants are really important to have in an area. This is kind of an opinion question, but from my view, if you don't know, I think it's best to find out. It shouldn't be a question of should I assume this is native or invasive. If it's on your property, please reach out and check out different resources and ask different people to find out what the plant is if you think it's invasive. And we can help you. And if it is invasive, then control it. But in my opinion, if you're not sure, I think it's best to leave potentially native plants to live. Diana asks if we had any advice on controlling creeping Charlie. I would suggest when we have the outro slide up for the next presentation to check out those resources, the Midwest Invasive Plant Network, and all these other DNR and all those kind of resources. And yeah, okay, so our next presentation will start in a minute now. So I'll leave my video up. Looks like we might have one more question. Kavita on Facebook asks if there's something that can be added to the soil after honeysuckle removal to encourage native plants to return. I don't know, nothing that I know of, but as long as you keep an area invasive free, you can plant native plants and nurture them. I don't know of any specific soil additives that would encourage native plants and prevent invasive ones. So I just recommend planting native plants.